So I'm going to talk about just the problem of structural change, something that some authors that I'm a part of a group we call creative syncretism, as an alternative, anti-dualist alternative to thinking about structural change, the problem of structural change. I'll give you a little bit of a tool which involves a 2x2 grid. I am, after all, a political scientist by training. So we are professionally required to create 2x2 tables. But my purpose is to encourage that we all scribble on it. On fait des gribouillages sur la grille.
Yes. So
Yes.
you're standing a little bit.
Am I in the way?
Yes.
Okay.
Not anymore.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. You can see that? Excellent. Let me just, I'll have to relocate to push the button. How about over here? I'll move around, don't worry. So, okay. We had a day. Okay. So, but first I want to encourage the graduate students to be a part of this interaction. So how many graduate students are left in the room? 1, 2, 3, cat, sank. Okay, so I'm going to just need a little bit of your help right about now. And I'm going to ask you to tell me about your project very, very briefly. And I want you to think about the relationship between human action, people doing things that you can identify. So agency, agence. And I want you to think about where in your story are there large-scale structures, states, market, eras of history, historical epochal change, religion. Think about elements in your story that seem to be much bigger than individual human action. Okay, and then I'm going to take some notes right here, because if I understand a little bit about your stories, we might be able to make this more interactive. When I try and propose a radical way of thinking about structure and agency as intimately intertwined, rather than separate. So who wants to go first? Over here, I'll go from left to right.
Hello, Professor. Hello, everyone. I'm a second year PhD candidate at the East China Normal University. I prefer Chinese, but in order to communicate with you fluently, I have to speak English.
We can translate. I can't, but
yeah, I'm okay.
Okay.
I'm very confident with my English.
Okay. Your English is lovely. It's much better than my Chinese or my French.
I'm major in the urban history of the United States.
Okay.
I'm interested in the environmental perspective of the urban history.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm now trying to examine the industrial cities in the steel belt in the northern U.S. Around the Grand Lakes, the industrial cities around the Great Lakes in the steel belt. These cities have experienced decline after the Second World War. To be more specific, since the 1980s. During this decline process, these cities experienced an environmental transformation. I want to examine, look into this transformation of environment. I think it's valuable to Chinese cities, to Indian cities, to global cities, to the cities in our globe, to the cities in the world. I think it's valuable.
And so, tell me again your name.
My name is Zhang Kaisheng.
John.
Yeah, Zhang.
Like
VH. Yeah.
Okay. And would you say that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just
It's okay.
So this is great, very, very nice, clear sense. Would you, the structural forces in your story might be economic decline, some changing market forces, is that accurate, you said?
Yes, I think my story will be multiple perspectives.
And just humor me, amuse the old man for a moment. Even this, though this may not be your way of doing it, if we could, in your story, think about that which is structural, so very large scale, not in the hands of human actors over here. So maybe market decline, maybe there's changes in the steel industry,
Yeah.
and then think about human beings doing something. So identifiable forms of agency. Is there anything in your story that comes to mind in terms of human agency?
Human agency.
Yeah.
Maybe.
What are people doing in this story?
There have been policy changes
Okay.
by the multiple governments,
Okay. So the actors then are policymakers.
policymakers,
Okay.
industrial, the interest groups,
Okay.
industrial interest groups,
What are they doing?
and environmental activism.
Okay. Let's call it environmental protest.
Yeah.
Great,
Environmental
okay.
protectors.
Good. So that's perfect.
They are, sorry,
No.
they are also common people. The residents of these areas.
Okay.
Yeah,
What
common residents. Yeah.
are they doing?
I think they could just like us. They must be pay much attention to the environment where they are living.
Are they suffering?
Yes, they are suffering. For example, there is a fire. There used to be a fire in the on the river
Oh, yeah.
above the water
Sure.
on the river in the city of GALVAN.
We Americans remember it, even though I was 5.
Yeah,
It's famous, very famous.
This is a mistaken story. Actually, David Stradlin, the professor in University of Cincinnati. Cincinnati is a city, University of Cincinnati. There is a professor named David Stradlin. He wrote a story about the Cleveland fire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a very complex story.
Yeah. Just one question on that before I move to the next student, and then I'm going to see if I can offer you,
Okay.
all the students, something that's useful. But let me just ask this question. Was the famous fire started by structures or by human agency?
Human agency. Yeah.
Somebody came out and the river was polluted and somebody threw a cigarette in the river.
No. Actually, he didn't mention the cause of the fire.
But it was human agency. It was the act polluting the river, dumping toxins.
Yeah, but common people talked much about the fire. Common people talked much TV shows, newspapers. Yeah, common people pay much attention to that.
So, and one of the things I heard you say is that common people kept this story alive.
Yes.
Ils ont maintenu l'histoire d'un fleuve qui était vraiment avec beaucoup de pollution, qui était toxique et qui s'allumait en feu en certainement en 1970, je crois. So 1970, plus ou moins.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jean, that's great. So I'm just collecting these so that we can talk about whether the next 50,000 slides I'm going to show you are useful or not. And you're going to tell me, oh, this makes no sense, or I don't understand, or tell me more. Okay, so we're going to try and make this useful for you. Okay. Tell me again your name. I know, of course you will. Zhang Shi, right? Like this? C-H-I. So, en français. E. I. Okay. Okay. And the ideal city.
Not ideal city is part of it.
Yeah.
Today's this topic is
Okay. Oh, I see. It's a small piece.
small piece.
Okay.
Ideal city.
Il faut parler français, c'est plus plus à l'aise.
I prefer English.
Oh, okay.
You talk to me in English.
Okay, good.
So, in terms of this cultural philosophy,
Okay. Cultural philosophy of Senghor and Negritude. Okay. All right.
and just to take it from just to take Sangho himself as a focus on Sangho himself experience.
Uh-huh.
And we know that he and Pompidou and they are classmates.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Pompidou is also the former president of France, and we can see their the relationship
Upper class. Okay. So in your story, I'm just hearing there are humans doing things like Senghor himself, Georges Pompidou. Right?
And the experience of Sangho himself, he also studies overseas in France, and he is native settler.
Uh-huh. So there's something, the structure, I'm going to just suggest some structures are something to do with the class system and the metropole-periphery relationship. Goes from the periphery to the metropole, and then he comes back.
And also he suffers from the World War I, and the first and second World War. And he also put in jail.
Okay. Okay. Is that okay for this?
But it is not my ideal city. There's no ideal city in California.
Right. No, just Senghor, Negritude, and cultural philosophy. Yeah. Okay. That's good. Okay. And next, well, of course, we know a little bit about your study. Remind me of your name.
My name is Suja.
Suja.
Actually, my surname. Z actually, Z. Sorry. Surname. Z actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, Z actually. Z actually.
Okay. Suja. Yeah.
I just gave the talk this morning at it. The trade and the colonization, the rise and the fall by more city and Sanya.
Okay. Good. And of course, when we heard your story today, it's very clear that colonial trade relations are important structures. There's a structure of trade.
Trade, trade and different relations between different high schools and different races.
Okay. Okay. Race relations. Okay. Maybe the colonial state should be here too.
Yes.
Okay. Colonial state. Good. And what about people doing things?
Different people doing different things. A lot of people, the Africans, they are mainly potters and farmers or slaves. The Shrazis are the mix of Persia and local African.
And what? Okay. And the mix.
They get married with each other.
Oh, that's good.
They are the mix.
That's definitely people doing things. Intermarriage. Okay.
And the Arabs are traders and the owner of the plantation.
Okay. Okay. So we have buying land. Okay. Good. Thank you. Chiché. Okay. Who's next? Two more. Yes. En français ou en anglais? Okay. C'est comment? Lami 5. Okay. Ouais. Moyen Âge. Okay.
partir du 8e siècle.
Okay.
Il y a des relations qui se mettent en place entre l'Afrique du Nord, le Sahara et le Soudan.
Okay.
Dans ce cadre, en fait, des relations, j'essaie d'analyser quelque part l'influence de ces relations qui sont commerciales dans l'organisation, en fait, dans l'évolution politique quelque part des États dans cet espace qu'on appelle le Soudan médiéval. Voilà. Donc, j'essaie d'analyser en fait comment l'armée a été utilisée comme instrument pour organiser l'espace.
C'est qui a utilisé l'armée pour organiser l'espace?
Les pouvoirs qui étaient en place.
Les rois, les nobles?
C'est bon. Moi, dans le cadre de mon travail, je n'utilise pas le terme de pouvoir, mais j'utilise plutôt, c'est l'aristocratie qui était en place.
Ok. Donc, c'est l'aristocratie qui utilise
C'est l'aristocratie qui va se saisir en fait de cette nouvelle donne, c'est-à-dire ces échanges entre l'Afrique du Nord et le Soudan pour mettre en place un système quelque part de contrôle du territoire. En fait, parce qu'au début, on avait des royaumes, mais ils vont utiliser en fait l'armée comme instrument pour pouvoir élargir l'espace politique et contrôler un peu ce réseau commercial qui va se mettre en place avec l'Afrique du Nord en profitant des retombées économiques.
Parfait. Ok. Et vous voyez, j'ai mis ici c'est l'échange transsaharien. C'est une structure et l'évolution, la formation, la centralisation des États. On pourrait dire que c'est un peu structurel, mais dans l'autre colonne, c'est aristocrate qui utilise l'armée pour former ou pour gérer l'État. C'est OK? OK. Et dernièrement, oui, c'est Amadou. Tidjane? Comme Sheikh Tidjane. OK, got it. Mal. OK. Oh, Mal. Sorry. Sorry. Je m'excuse. OK.
Je travaille sur le thème exploitation des phosphates de terre.
Oui.
Exploitation des phosphates de terre.
Oui. OK. Et vous avez bien éclairé ce matin, cet après-midi. Et donc, les structures dans votre étude sont lesquelles? Et les structures, par contre, l'activité des individus.
En fait, bon, à travers ce sujet, comme je l'ai dit ce matin, j'essaie de répondre comment l'exploitation des phosphates de terre à travers les différentes phases de son évolution a eu à restructurer la vie des populations de Donc, en fait, c'est une étude qui va montrer que, qui va dégager le contexte dans lequel les industries extractives sont nées. Et dans les industries extractives, évidemment, les phosphates, principalement. Et parmi les industries extractives également, on a mis l'accent surtout sur la compagnie sénégalaise des phosphates de Taïwan, créée en 1957 et gérée d'abord par des étrangers. On a essayé de voir comment, à partir de cette gestion étrangère de la CSPC, on est passé à une gestion sénégalaise avec la sénégalisation en 1975 et comment cette sénégalisation a été bien commencée et s'est mal terminée parce que c'est une sénégalisation qui va déboucher sur la crise des 16 au début des années 2000. C'est pour faire appel de nouveau aux étrangers. Les Indiens et après les Noirs.
Parfait. OK. Donc, ça, c'était pour moi très utile parce que j'ai entendu un peu de 5 projets. I've understood now a little bit about your 5 projects. And I, of course, only just heard about these projects recently. So I'm trying to say that in each of the projects, they may have this wrong, but in each of the projects you have some structural forces at work. Most recently in Amadou's work, the organization of business, so as a société d'État, later as an entreprise privée avec droit par an international. Those are structures. And then clearly, very clearly in your story, foreign investors, Indian foreign investors, Indonesian foreign investors are doing things. They're live actors. And so are Senegalese managers. And we could add, of course, these lists for your projects, these are very incomplete lists. But it just gives us, I want to get in the room as we continue some sense of the difference between structure and agency in real projects. Okay? So far, so good? Yes? John?
Hello, sir. I'm sorry, I have to revise the column of the structure
Okay.
for my
Okay.
for my research.
Go for it. What would you say instead?
There are economic factors.
Yeah.
These two are both economic factors.
Yeah.
There are also political regions.
Okay.
Political regions.
Great.
Federal, state, local
Oh, good.
government relations. And besides, there are factors about the environmental ideas, environmental thoughts, environmental theories,
Wow.
environmental ideas. Environmental ideas. Yeah.
Can I say environmentalism?
Yeah. Sure.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Yes. Mami.
Bon, moi, je pense qu'il y a une dimension qui est fondamentale dans le cadre de mon travail,
Oui.
qui n'apparaît pas par rapport à ce que vous avez donné, c'est la question de l'esclavage.
Ok. Est-ce que l'esclavage, c'est une institution, à votre avis?
C'est une institution.
Ok, donc je vais dire que toutes institutions sont des structures. Mais je vous provoque, parce que je vais décomposer ça bientôt. Okay, so I'm going to put, no, it's, the institution of slavery is not in Tanzania, it is in Tanzania. Slavery as institution. Okay, beautiful. And one of the great things about this, here we have a variety of structures. We have structures just in using Jean's work. We have structures of the economy, economic relations, the position of these firms in relation to each other, probably to international markets. We clearly have a set of political structures or institutions, regulation. Wonderful that it's the US, because the US has a strange layering of these institutions, federal, state, and local government. And then we have an ideological, we have a typo, but don't worry about that. We have an ideological sort of schema called environmentalism. So, dans tout ce colonne-là, nous avons une grande variété des structures idéologiques, institutionnelles, on peut dire économiques, politiques, and ensuite de suite. Okay. I think that when we think about structures, at least in my part of the part of the academy that I occupy, which is somewhere between political science and anthropology, we have a problem explaining structural change. So you may not be interested in explaining structural change, but I bet it's important. Because I think when we think about Senghor's negritude, it is influencing a structure called the consciousness of the the late colonial and post-colonial world. So I would imagine that in all of your stories there is structural change. But when we think about certain kinds of structures in general, what we call in political science institutions, by which we sometimes mean they're combinations of rules, taken for granted principles, cognitive schemas, regular routines, norms, or the mechanisms of enforcement for all of those. Or when we think about state, market, class, culture, education is a great example, media, another great example. These, in my mind, are all bundles of institutions. The state is nothing more than a bundle of rules and routines and the systems to enforce them. Habitus, for Bourdieu, those who know him, another big structure. Epistemes, Foucauldian epistemes, I would think of as these large structures. And we can spend an entire day on this claim, that structures have a very difficult time explaining their own change. Structures, in the work that we tend to do, produce order and regularity. They manage behavior, they channel behavior, but they don't really tell us how structures evolve or break down or transform themselves. And we often resort to agentic interruptions. Great men do something. In the course of a breakdown, there is a revolution. So I think of this as a very weak explanation for how structures change. Sure, it happens, but it's very difficult to theorize. In the study of institutions, we have, in economics and political science, we have a lot of efforts to think about structural change as an epiphenomenon, as a second result of structure itself. So one of the best examples is path dependency, dépendance de chemin, which is the idea that if a society takes a certain step at an early critical moment, a critical juncture, then it determines the path that it will follow. So just the most famous example from Paul Pearson, who is the seminal author on this, is the idea that in some Western European countries, the welfare state was built early in the 1910s and 20s. So social support systems for the unemployed, old age pensions, and publicly funded healthcare. In a country like the United States, much of this was not built at the critical juncture when labor was politically incorporated. And so it becomes the United States follows a path where it is very difficult to put in place publicly funded healthcare because it wasn't done at the critical moment of the socio-political compact. So the result, which is a very different kind of welfare state in the US and Western Europe, is the outcome of a structural moment. The path determined the outcome. In this story, there are no human beings doing anything except at the critical juncture. So many of these accounts of structural change try and find the source of structural change in the structure themselves. So competition in the market, in steel production, in the Great Lakes region, especially as South Korea is becoming a producer, accounts for the decline. So what I'm going to suggest is that, of course we think that way, but we really need to identify actual actors doing things, because structures themselves don't actually do anything. They're always mediated by actors. And you'll see, if we have time, or if we get into it later, I draw heavily on Michel de Certeau, on Claude Lévi-Strauss, and on Bruno Latour, and John Dewey for making these points. So a kind of theory of human action is where we're going. So I want to ask the question, what if we thought about structures in terms of lived experience, in how they look to people from the inside, how they feel from the inside. And we can then assume that order, regularity, institutions, culture itself, patrimony, norms, ethnic groups, these are all important as resources, but they determine nothing by themselves. They are usable raw material. How would we frame this idea? The point of this idea is to get a much closer empirical understanding of how structures actually change, so that we know how the idea of negritude influences the end of colonialism. So that we know how the trans-Saharan trade actually forms the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Ghana Empire. And so we understand why there is a shift to the coastal kingdoms of Wala, Jolof, Kayur, Sin, and Salu. Our accounts tend to be because trade moved from the Sahara to the coast. And that's a structural account that requires some agency to flesh it out, to get a more complete picture. So the idea that I want to propose is something called creative syncretism. It's a very, very deliberate use of the term syncretism, which is borrowed from religious studies, to convey the idea of unauthorized poaching or mixing of elements from more than one origin. And this is an experiential account of change. It's anti-dualist, which means it doesn't accept the separation of structure from agency. And it's seen from within. There are two steps to this, and they're both outlined in some work that I've done. The first is the step of thinking about structure as a repertoire or a dépôt, or a verge des déchets, and thinking about the decomposition and recombination of institutions. And then the second step is to think about who does this, why do they do this, and how do their creative efforts relate to each other? Questions so far? I'm going to pause, see if any of this is making you more confused. C'est clair? Vous pouvez, surtout les étudiants, parce que le but de cette intervention, c'est que peut-être vous allez quitter aujourd'hui avec quelque chose d'utile que vous n'aviez pas au moment où vous êtes venu. Okay, je vais continuer, because I know I don't have all day. So let me talk a little bit about where this comes from theoretically. It comes from the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey and his account of the creativity of human action. We definitely don't have time to go into it deeply, but very quickly, for Dewey, all human action involves facing a new situation. We are confronted with a changing economic situation. We're confronted with losing a job. We're confronted with choosing where to go to dinner. We're confronted with choosing whether to continue a relationship or end a relationship. All of these are new situations. All of them trigger in us a remembrance of prior similar situations. But the key Deweyan proposition here is that no two situations are ever really the same. And so we have to go through our memory of how I solved this problem before, or how my uncle solved the problem, or someone I saw on television solved the problem, and try and make that solution useful in the next moment. So Dewey describes, the key to Dewey, which he spends a lot of time discussing, is the écran de projection d'imagination. We take prior solution fragments and we play them out on the projector screen of our imagination. What would happen if, when I'm choosing to go to Paris or stay in Senegal, I think about what someone else did? How will that play out for me? And then my action is a recombination of the example that I have in memory from what someone else did. I'm rearranging it and taking my new action, is the key Deweyan concept. So every action is a kind of rearrangement of prior resources of how people did this before. Action itself is inherently creative. Dewey has a wonderful account of a person who's building a wall with stones. And when one is laying the stone, each stone has to be placed just precisely, but the laying of each stone is in relationship to the handling of the previous stone. And so the whole business of making a wall with stone is creative, but situated in the heritage of how maybe my father was a stonemason, and I learned how to handle those stones. And I just handled a stone 10 minutes ago that was shaped this way, and now I know how to place the next one. So there's an inherent taking apart and recombining memories of prior action. And the action that I take goes into the inventaire, the catalog of remembered actions. So the actions that I take stimulate the next person's action. We live, in this view, in a junkyard. What is a junkyard in French? Non, pas ça. Un endroit où on dépose des choses soi-disant inutiles pour l'instant, mais on va aller là-bas pour trouver un bazar, peut-être, oui. C'est sûr, je sais, au dépôt, vers de ferraille. Ferraille. Mais l'idée ici, c'est que ce sont des choses rejetées. Quelqu'un les a rejetées. Dépotoir. That sounds good. Dépotoir. Et dans le dépotoir, il y a deux actions. Il y a l'action de déposer le truc, et il y a une autre action, peut-être par quelqu'un d'autre, peut-être par moi-même, d'aller chercher quelque chose d'inutile. Récupérer. Okay. This is a magasin de consignation. Donc c'est la même idée. J'ai des anciens vêtements, je l'aime plus, ou je suis devenu beaucoup plus gros et je dois je vais les donner quelque part. Et vous allez venir, vous allez feuilleter dans les choses et trouver quelque chose que tu aimes. Donc moi je l'aime plus, mais toi tu l'aimes. This is Dewey's creativity of action. All of life exists in the junkyard.
So social changes, we're buying your shirts.
Social changes, you're buying my shirts, depending on what you do with them. Exactly, exactly. Just for the Senegalese in the room, I'll try not to belabor this point. There is an old, sort of 15-year-old, I think, cartoon, and it was dans la télévision, un caractère typiquement sénégalais qui s'appelle Gorgorlu. Gorgorlu en Wolof veut dire se débrouiller. Gorgorlu in Wolof means find a way, jerry-rig. Put it together without having the right means. Improvise. Lévi-Strauss would call this bricoler, engage in bricolage. And Gorgorlu lives his life in a state of bricolage. Here, his wife is always mad at him because he doesn't have any money for the dépenses quotidiennes. She's supposed to make the lunch, he doesn't have any money. She yells at him, and then she embarrasses him in front of the neighbors. It's a standard Gorgorlu sort of theme. And then Gor decides to go do something. He says, "Attendez, j'arrive." They're discussing how stupid Gorgorlu is. And then he comes back, they're shocked, and now he is dressed as a lutteur sénégalais. So this is the second most popular sport in Senegal, which is the traditional wrestling. So he is now going to, that day he knows that there's a big loot, and he's going to go compete in the loot. He has no skill whatsoever. He's going to get clobbered, but he's going to make some money doing it. So he's always improvising and finding a way. And we tend to assume that this kind of creativity, everyday creativity, is something at the margins. Something that very poor people do. Something that people who are struggling do. And of course that's true, but as you'll see, what I'm trying to suggest is the nature of human action itself, and it helps us situate action in relation to structures, as long as we accept that structures are like this. They are decomposable and subject to recombination. And I want to just give you a little more. So Dewey is writing in the 1920s. He's a pretty early theorist of these ideas, and we live in his nightmare, actually. He did not think that creative innovation would happen all the time. He actually may be more well known as a theorist of education because he believed that the only way to maintain this kind of creativity was to empower young people, small children, to see their own creativity. And that if we indoctrinate young children to be disciplined, to do what they're told, to produce mathematical results or reports that are expected from them, to sit in seats, to salute, to march out to recess, to come back, then we would kill the capacity for human creativity. The one thing that would produce the nightmare is authoritarian education, which is exactly the education I believe all of us received. And part of higher education is, part of what we're trying to do in higher education is unlearn all of those terrible habits. It's part of why you're in PhD programs in some sense, is to teach you, is to empower you to have the ability to go back to your normal creativity. This, in some ways, authoritarian education is Foucault's modernity. It's a modernity in which we are disciplined to follow certain kinds of epistemic frameworks, which change sometimes, but we don't really know exactly how. Foucault himself goes to Iran after the Iranian Revolution and becomes a reporter for the Paris Daily, I believe it was Le Devoir, so that he can study how this might change. And he was much criticized by the left, and particularly feminists, for doing this, and eventually abandoned the project of studying the Iranian Revolution. So, and this is The Matrix, the popular film of 10 or 15 years ago, which is essentially a film version of Foucault's modernity. So I think that when we turn to Michel de Certeau, we find a way out. We find an exit from this problem. Without doing a complete exegesis of Certeau, but using this Senegalese classroom as an example, Certeau argues that he sees a tension between what he calls strategic orders. Strategic orders use command of space to control behavior and normalize people. Strategic orders are strong institutions. The classroom is a strong institution. It locates people, locates me here, you there, you're in rows, there's a clock, it determines what we're doing, and I can command the movement of your body while you're in the classroom, make you write things, make you stand up, sit down. So these strategic orders exist everywhere for Certeau. They, however, confront what Certeau theorizes or calls everyday life, la vie quotidienne. And this is really where the really interesting part of Certeau comes in, is this idea that in just living our lives, we consume and transform strategic orders through something he calls tactics, or braconnage, poaching. And these, our acts of braconnage, of tactics, change these strategic orders. So let me give you an example. I'm actually taking the picture here in 2002 or something in a classroom in Dakar. And it's a very obvious strategic order, but I'm standing in the back, and while I'm taking the pictures, this boy holds up this drawing. So while this is happening, while I'm sitting in the back, the teacher is giving a lecture, I think, on French grammar. Students are supposed to be understanding the passé composé. But he is spending his time making a doodle, a drawing. And people from Senegal, and people from Senegal know exactly who this is. Let me make it a little bigger. That is a rendering of the only photograph of Cheikh Amadou Bamba. Cheikh Amadou Bamba was the most important figure in anti-colonial resistance in the late 19th century in Senegal. He founded the Mouride Brotherhood. He effectively built the Senegalese political economy because his movement was so popular that the French tried to exile him to Gabon, eventually came back, and his movement mobilized the labor to get the entire rural peanut production economy moving. The French government thought that was fine, as long as they're producing peanuts, we'll leave them alone, and that has been the spine of Senegalese political economy for over a century. There's one picture of him. You'll see it everywhere. He's wearing this sort of cloak, turban, and the boy is re-rendering it, while he's supposed to be studying le passé composé. So he is engaged in tactical action in the classroom. I may be over-interpreting, but Certeau would say he's using the classroom, he's engaged in la perruque, he's using the instruments of the classroom, pen and paper, to do something that is meaningful for him, while the class is trying to place him in a strategic order that has no meaning for him. But he engages in everyday resistance, and this disrupts the classroom. It makes the classroom something other than an ideal location for the reproduction of the structure, which is education. And the other kids notice, and the Senegalese education system in general has this problem. African education systems have this problem, that they're not teaching African realities, they're teaching often European realities. So for me, this is a great example of what Certeau describes. The crucial point here, without going into too much detail, is that for Certeau, these strategic orders, these classrooms, military systems, systems of taxation, systems of policing, are always disrupted. And so the surface of these orders is everywhere punched and torn open by ellipses, by drifts, by leaks of meaning. It is what he calls a sieve order, an order with holes in it that they poop. So, I won't go into these examples, but for Certeau, cooking is always an example, a great example. Cooking food is always an example of the relationship between structure and between strategy and tactics. A recipe is a strategic order. As hard as you may try, you will always make it a little bit differently because you can't precisely measure the amount of garlic or the size of the chicken or the element of spices. There's always creativity. Reading itself is an example of this tactical action because we never really read from the beginning to the end. We skim around, and every time we read something, we associate it in memory with something new. So each reading, today if I read, I will remember the sound of the children in the play yard, and it will influence that construction of the text in my memory. So the crucial point for us is that tactical perturbation, tactical change, is characteristic of how we live in these strategic orders. And under modernity, it's a characteristic of human existence. So, whereas Dewey provides us with an idealistic version of this, which doesn't really work in the Foucauldian world, Certeau gives us a way of getting out of it, so that we live in these kind of junkyards. Okay. And you see this in art, you see this in religion, you see it in politics, the Goddess of Liberty in Tiananmen Square in 1989. You see that in all forms of everyday life. Actually, parkour is like this could have been Sam's brother because he is a Certeauian tactician par excellence. Often, Certeau is dismissed because of the assumption that tactics are very weak and will not achieve anything. Leftist readers of Certeau in the 1970s were very concerned that we couldn't organize revolution or radical change around Certeauian tactics because he always says that they cannot hold what they can gain. I think the more important problem in Certeau actually is his own dualism between strategies and tactics, a false dichotomy. So what I want to offer you, and then I'm going to offer you just a little bit more, so I hope that's not trying your patience. And then I'm going to just open it back up to see what kind of questions particularly the graduate students have. Or maybe you have questions now that you want to pose.
Vous avez des questions même? Questions à poser?
Ok. Bon. S'il n'y a pas de questions.
No question, il n'y a pas de question.
I think they got your end.
Yes, I know. So I can end now, but I can give you just a little bit more. That's stop the phone.
I'm looking at a clock, you know, 5.
What's that?
I said I'm just looking at our clock.
What time is it now?
5, if we go 5.
Yeah, let me give you just a little bit more. Let me show you what I mean by scribbling. So let me jump to here. Okay. So when we think about people engaging in this kind of creative action, we want to think about two axes. Intention, ou but, intention or goal, and pouvoir. And as I mentioned, the goal is to scribble all over the axes. So the point here is to think about how people engage in creativity from inside, from an experiential point of view. So when we think about intention, we're asking, what do we think we're doing? What do we think we're doing when we act creatively? And who the hell do we think we are to be able to act creatively? So this is the subjective experience of power, not some objective measurement of power. And this is the subjective feeling of what I'm trying to do. So we can say that when we engineer, when we have a high intention, we have a sense of our own capacity to do this, if we are doing it because we've done it before, and because we can promote to others what we're doing. That's what the work of an engineer. So in architecture and art, the work of an engineer would look like this. A designed building, a construction firm, or a planned mural commissioned by a city. The opposite of engineering in English might be to ramshackle, se débrouiller, se bricoler. No sense of prior precedent, not really planning to promote it. I'm just making do. I'm throwing together this building, I'm expressing myself on the wall. If we feel like we have privilege, then we sense that we have authority, we have access to resources, and we know what to do with them. If we are audacious, we sense that we don't have authority, we don't have access to resources, and we really don't know how to handle them, but we're going to act anyway. So that creates the 2x2 space. Most of the time we collapse the axes. We think that privilege defines engineering. So that only the privileged can engineer, and only the weak can ramshackle. So I would just say, very critical in this account, don't collapse the axis. Don't do this. Privileged people, like corporate managers, also have to improvise. Weak people also plan their own solutions, like revolving credit schemes. So the goal of the grill is to suggest interaction among these kinds of projects. And let me just show you an example, which is actually the example of the origins of the Murid Brotherhood in Senegal. And this will be my last point. So we begin with a project of privileged engineering, which is the building by the French of an imperial state, 1830s onward. It actually is related to the Sufi jihad movements of the 1860s to 1900. These movements emerge in part as a result of learning from and aligning with the French imperial project. So this is a planned action, creative action on the part of the privileged. This is an emergency creative action on the part of the weak. The critical moment in the formation of the Murid Brotherhood is when Sheikh Ibrahim Afal, who was a warrior in the Wolof kingdom, decided that he would convert to Islam and bring with him all the other warriors, provided that the religious leader, Amadou Bamba, agreed to his terms. And his terms were, I will not pray, I will not fast, I will not give alms, I will not go to Mecca, but I will work really hard for my martyr. I will be your devoted servant for my religious leader. The deal is struck. Sheikh Ibrahim Afal becomes the first and most important follower of Amadou Bamba. Together they found the Murid movement, and we had a whole group, social group of warriors become Muslims on these terms, and provide incredibly disciplined labor on what will become peanut plantations. This makes the Murid movement, when Ibrahim Afal did this, he was just one actor. He was ramshackling. He was coming up with a solution. His society was dying. He had to improvise. But it repositions the Murid movement as the most popular and dynamic Sufi movement of that period. The French respond, they're worried. They have to improvise. They have to ramshackle, and they send Bamba off to exile in Gabon and in Mauritania because they're desperately worried about the power of this movement. Meanwhile, these rural schools that are set up by the Murid leaders gradually transition into peanut plantations. Have people who are devoted, providing lots of labor out in the countryside, and the peanut is being introduced. There's a nice synergy there. There is some innovation on the part of workers, followers, devotees that produces the Murids as the key collaborators in peanut production. So once it becomes clear that they're good at growing the cash crop, a compromise is built with the French colonial state that says, we will now tolerate the Murid movement. You can exist. We will actually invest and build wells and build schools and build roads. The Senegalese government, Macky Sall, just built the autoroute all the way out to Touba for exactly this reason. And this compromise between a kind of rural semi-aristocracy that manages labor and the colonial and post-colonial state, this is the axis that defines Senegal, but it was built not because structures chose to change, but through an interplay of these kinds of creative actions. So it may be that in your projects on Cleveland, on Negritude, on the trade relations in Tanzania, on the formation of states in the medieval period, and certainly on the phosphate industry, some version of an analysis which tries to take agency seriously will be useful for you. I hope so, and I thank you for listening to me.